Imagine living at a time when bathing wasn't a daily necessity, but a luxury so rare, people were willing to die for it. Misconceptions about the hygiene practices of people from the Middle Ages are widespread, but the truth might just be too unbelievable to stomach. Here are the 15 strange things about hygiene in the Middle Ages. Number 15. They bathed more than you think. The Middle Ages have unfortunately gotten a bad reputation when it comes to hygiene. Many people today still believe that people back then lived in filth and didn't bathe, but this couldn't be further from the truth. During this time, over 80% of people worked outdoors, and just like today, felt uncomfortable being dirty and sweaty, which meant washing was done by most daily. Some places used cisterns and gravity to provide an early version of running water in cities, but most people got their water from wells using buckets. Hauling heavy buckets of water took a lot of work, so peasants sometimes reused the same water for days. They either bathed in half barrels, pouring small amounts of unheated water over themselves from a jug, or carried home less water and simply rinsed off in rivers and lakes. Nobles were a bit luckier, having servants heat up large baths with fuel peasants couldn't afford. This lack of hot water also meant that despite usually keeping clean, peasants in colder areas often went entire winters without a bath. But being stinky is better than hypothermia, I suppose. Many cities also provided public baths, sort of like communal pools where large numbers of people would bathe, with Nuremberg having 14 during this era. Soaps weren't as common as today, but still existed. It wasn't like the clean-scented bars of today, usually being soft mushes made from things like potash, animal fat, or harsh chemicals like lye. While people weren't as dirty as some believe, the rumors didn't come from nowhere, as we're about to cover. Number 14. The church banned bathing. While we did just explain why it was a myth that people in the Middle Ages didn't bathe, there's actually more to the story. This myth has some truth to it, coming from a mix of the Catholic Church temporarily condemning bathing as sinful and, surprisingly, the Black Death. While bathing and public baths were common since ancient times, there was also an association between bathhouses, temptation, and lewd behavior. Thus, over time, the church's policies on bathing became more and more strict, saying public bathing led to promiscuity, sinfulness, and disease. Many people still attended public baths, but some chose only to wash their hands, face, feet, and teeth without removing clothing later into the Middle Ages. However, after the Black Death killed 2/3 of all Europeans, the church doubled down on their position about bathing causing disease. This later became a widespread medical belief even doctors would preach. However, religious tradition required Jewish and Muslim people to wash themselves regularly, which caused fewer people of these groups to die of plague. This created resentment towards them among Christians. Royals and nobles took the church's obscene advice to heart, and some stories about them are downright disgusting. According to the account of a Russian ambassador to France, Louis XIV stunk like a wild animal. This was because Louis's doctor had recommended he bathe as little as possible, and Louis took this to heart, claiming he'd bathed only twice in his life. So how did the royals deal with the horrible stench? Number 13. Body odor and perfume. It doesn't take much for the human body to start producing pungent odors. Today, we have powerful deodorants, antiperspirants, and perfumes. But people in the Middle Ages had their own odd ways of masking body odor. Most rubbed cloths doused in perfumes and scented oils all over their bodies to fend off unpleasant scents. However, the royals of Europe took this to another level, like Queen Isabel I of Spain, who claimed she'd bathed twice in her life, when she was born and when she was married. At least she was clean for her husband, even though he was her cousin. Royals could afford more expensive oils and perfumes to mask their body odor. These were usually made from olive or almond oil bases and were mixed with pleasant smells like rosemary, sage, roses, sandalwood, and cloves. Some perfumes were even extracted from the scent glands of animals, creating musky smells. People sometimes wore nosegays or sachets of scented oils, herbs, and spices around their necks or wrist. Interestingly, it was believed by many that wearing a piece of garlic or onion around their neck would ward off bad odors. While you might think this just created a different bad smell, we now know that these pungent plants actually have antimicrobial antimicrobial properties that kill bacteria which cause body odor. While these methods may not have been as effective as modern deodorants and antiperspirants, they did provide some relief from the body odor that plagued people in the Middle Ages, but there were some more powerful smells to worry about as well. Number 12. Toilets. Sewers and flushable toilets are modern conveniences we take for granted that people in the Middle Ages would have killed for. Medieval toilets were holes called cesspits, above which people did their business. Peasants typically had communal toilets with wood benches just above the cesspit. At night, they'd use chamber pots, which would be emptied into the cesspit in the morning. Aristocrats and royals had it a bit better, with castles having private toilets called garderobes that either led to holes servants would empty into the cesspit or to early plumbing systems made of lead, which were flushed with water by servants and dropped out directly into moats or cesspits. Toilet paper wasn't invented until 1857, so people had to get creative. Communal toilets housed rags on the end of sticks that people used to wipe. And yes, they were shared by everyone. Outside these public toilets, the most common methods for wiping were fresh leaves, rags, and, as disgusting as it may sound, people's bare hands with water from a jug, like the iotas used in India. This practice led to the left hand being seen as the unclean hand, as it was the one used for wiping. Even today, certain cultures see shaking with the left hand as unacceptable and dirty due to this medieval practice. Number 11. Dealing with waste. Even people in the Middle Ages knew that keeping sewage separate from drinking and cleaning water is of the utmost importance. Drinking or washing with contaminated water can cause horrible diseases like cholera, dysentery, or diphtheria. Cities in the Middle Ages stunk to high heaven with how much waste there was, coming both from humans and the animals like horses and cattle that lived among them. So when cesspits became full, it was an incredibly important task to empty them. This was done by people called gong merchants, as gong was another name for cesspits, who in the night shoveled all the waste out of cesspits in cities and towns and carted it out of the city limits. Unfortunately, many times this waste would seep into groundwater or be dumped upstream into rivers that lead directly back into cities, causing massive outbreaks of dysentery and other diseases all throughout the Middle Ages. Animal waste in particular was a massive worry, as animals simply went wherever, including city streets. This was such a problem that by early Victorian times, people predicted that within 100 years, the entire city of London would be several feet deep in horse manure. Thankfully, cars came along and prevented that nightmarish situation. Number 10. Feminine hygiene. Even today, it's not fun to go through your time of the month as a woman, but as you might imagine, women in the Middle Ages had a much harder time with menstruation. Without modern conveniences like pads or tampons, women either free-bled or used makeshift rags, cloths, or even twigs and leaves to clean their menses. Cotton was the preferred material over wool, as it absorbed liquid, while wool repelled it, meaning it was less effective. Some women even wrapped cotton around twigs to use like a tampon. Likely the most shocking practice of the era was using a common sphagnum bog moss with incredible absorbent properties to stuff into menstrual cloths. Middle-aged societies largely refused to aid women during their cycles, as it was believed menstruation was a punishment from God for Eve eating the fruit in the Garden of Eden. Nonetheless, women secretly helped each other, devising herbal remedies for cramps and pain. Women in the Middle Ages also had fewer periods than today, due largely to poor nutrition, especially low iron, as meat was a rare luxury for peasants, as well as their rough lifestyles of doing hard manual labor outdoors. Women also had more babies than today, with communities having multiple women breastfeeding each other's children year-round. To top it all off, these lifestyle factors also led to earlier menopause, usually starting in women's late 30s. Overall, while women still suffer through their time of the month today, it's nowhere near as bad as it was a millennium ago. Number 9. Don't let the bedbugs bite. All organisms need to sleep, and of course humans are no exception. While today, most people sleep on plush mattresses, people in the Middle Ages lacked this luxury. Most medieval people slept on beds made of straw, a relatively flexible but rough plant, which has the unfortunate side effect of being the favorite meal of vermin and bugs. The straw in beds was rarely changed, making it an absolute paradise for hordes of fleas, lice, bedbugs, and other insects. Being bitten in your sleep back then was as normal as breathing. It was just unavoidable. Every morning, people would use basins of water kept in the home to wash their faces and heads in an attempt to remove any parasites who'd hitched a ride. Much like today, people tried to get rid of or at least manage infestations with pesticides, but rather than strong chemicals, all they had were herbs and flowers with strong smells. Basil, chamomile, lavender, and mint were commonly mixed into the straw bedding to ward off these biting insects, but they weren't exactly extremely effective. Insects biting people in their sleep was such a common daily reality that it left echoes which last even today, mainly in the common saying, "Sleep tight, don't let the bedbugs bite." Number 8. Hand washing. People in the Middle Ages largely worked outdoors, so their hands got dirty on the daily. This made hand washing an invaluable practice that was done frequently, many times throughout the day. As hand washing required little water, it wasn't as much of a chore to lug enough water home from wells for it. Upon waking up, hands, teeth, and faces were washed with water from a basin. Hands were also washed after working, and most importantly, before eating and drinking. During the Middle Ages, cutlery hadn't become widespread, so people ate with their hands rather than forks or knives. Hand washing was performed both before and after each meal, and etiquette of the time stated it was customary to wash your hands after a meal and then enjoy a drink. A 14th century recipe for hand washing water involved boiling water with things like sage, orange peel, marjoram, or chamomile, then letting it cool until lukewarm before use. Soap made from animal fats, oils, or alkaline solutions like lime and salt could also be used. Number 7. They weren't drunk all the time. There's a widespread belief that water in the Middle Ages was so ridden with waste and bacteria that it was safer to drink ale or beer, which means the people then were constantly drunk. As fascinating as it might seem, this is a complete myth. Fresh sources of water were plentiful in the Middle Ages, including the rivers most civilizations were built around, and wells people pumped their water from. Still, the medieval diet did contain large amounts of beer. Unlike modern beer, medieval beer was brewed mostly from barley and had a lower alcohol content. Beer was viewed more as a nutritious alternative to water, with more calories, who were greatly needed by peasants who suffered from poor nutrition. The average peasant's diet consisted mainly of grains, eating 2 to 3 pounds of it, mostly bread and beer every day. Meat was largely a luxury reserved for the wealthy. Peasants would occasionally slaughter their own animals for meat, but unlike the royals who had daily access to fresh meat, they'd have to preserve it with salt or vinegar so it could last. Holidays were the main time the average person ate meat, and it was typically cured or pickled meat, closer to jerky than a ribeye. So how did their diets affect their teeth? I'm glad you asked. Number 6. Dental health. Toothaches are a horrible annoyance today, but in the Middle Ages, a toothache could be life-threatening. Dentistry was not a practice in the same way medicine was. Shockingly, it wasn't doctors, but barbers who performed dental surgeries in the Middle Ages, as well as many other types of surgery, which we will cover in gory detail later. As dental surgeries could cause bleeding sores which could easily become infected and fatal, non-invasive measures were most commonly used. People typically cleaned their teeth with twigs, some of which had antibacterial properties, as well as linen or wool cloth covered with salves and pastes made from exfoliating ingredients like salt to wipe away grime and tooth worms. These were worms medieval people believed lived in their teeth, which caused dental problems if you didn't clean them upon waking up. Typically, herbal remedies were used to treat dental issues. Bloodletting, or purposefully letting someone bleed a large amount, was also a common prescription. In severe cases, barbers would perform extractions. As there was no anesthesia at the time, patients would drink concoctions containing alcohol or opium to help with the pain or fall asleep. Thankfully, cavities were much rarer then, as the medieval diet consisted of much less sugar and acids than we consume today. However, food like stone-ground grain and hard bread did cause some issues. Before our next strange entry, if you're enjoying the video, don't forget to smash the like button and subscribe to see more great videos like this one. And don't forget to hit that bell to be notified as soon as our newest videos come out. Now it's time for today's subscriber pick. One of our subscribers sent this rather interesting image depicting some outrageous female hygiene and fashion trends from olden times. On the left, was this a medieval practice for female hygiene, or might this woman have been doing something unspeakable down there? And even crazier, on the right, what could this historic female fashion trend have been? Was she covering up or baring herself to the world? Knowing the standards of fashion at the time, This woman must have turned quite a few heads. But that's where you come in. Tell us what exactly you think is going on in these outrageous images. How do you think society would have responded to these women in the Middle Ages? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to use the hashtag #subscriberpick so we're sure to see your best guesses. Now let's head back in time once more, because you won't believe this next shocking fact about hygiene in the Middle Ages. Number 5. Surgery. Until less than 2 human lifetimes ago, surgery was a near certain death sentence. While doctors did exist during the Middle Ages, surgery was performed by the same barbers who performed dentistry. These barbers used sharp tools that looked more like instruments of torture than healing, like the dental pelican, to perform these surgeries on patients with no anesthesia. Shockingly, there are even records of medieval barbers removing oral cancer. 13th century accounts explain that if a growth is hard and black, referring to necrotic cancers, it's hard to treat, but that early-stage oral cancers could be cured by cutting into the healthy flesh around it, cauterizing the tumor, then rubbing the wound with egg yolk. The wound would then be washed with red wine and a lotion made of honey, wine, and various medicinal plants. The most skilled of these surgeons also performed a surgery called trepanning to deal with mental illness and neurological issues, wherein they cut a hole into the head to supposedly relieve pressure in the skull, leaving an exposed area of brain matter behind. Limb amputations and cauterizations were also performed by barbers. Barbers relied heavily on alcohol and opium to handle the horrific pain of these surgeries. And while there weren't sanitation standards of today, they attempted to use wine as an antiseptic. Still, infections were incredibly common afterwards, and without antibiotics, survivability was abysmally low. Number 4. Medieval underwear. Laundry was incredibly labor-intensive during the Middle Ages, so people typically wore linen undergarments across their entire bodies to keep from sweating into their primary clothes. Peasants would typically wash only the linens, with outer clothes rarely being laundered. These linen undergarments ranged from very basic loincloths to the more famous bray, which were loose drawers worn by men with a drawstring or leather belt that could be tightened around the waist. Women of the upper classes may only have worn underwear during their time of the month. Women of the upper classes may only have worn underwear during their time of the month, as their fanciful large dresses along with petticoats and brassiers would have been too complicated to remove any time they needed to use the toilet. Garments worn during the menstrual cycle would have been tight loincloths used to secure cotton or moss-based pads. Legs of both men and women were covered with hose, long stockings that went all the way up and could be strapped either to the bray or onto the foot. Most shocking were male cod pieces, originally simple cloths that covered the male's privates. By the 16th century, men of the upper classes had made cod pieces a major fashion statement, wearing ornate and colorful ones to draw attention to their crotches. While this might seem too absurd to believe, it's not too dissimilar from wearing designer underwear and saggy pants in modern times. Number 3. Haircuts and body hair. Much like today, hair care and hair removal were incredibly important during the Middle Ages. With mirrors being a luxury only the wealthy could afford, barbers were indispensable to every community. Working men went to have their face shaven every few days, with monks in monasteries shaving one another's heads and faces every day to appear clean before God. With lice being such a massive problem, washing of the head was of the utmost importance. In some periods, alkaline mixtures of lye and salt were used as a rudimentary shampoo, while at other times it was thought that washing the hair too often could lead to poor health and hair loss. Facial hair removal for women became trendy during the reign of Queen Elizabeth, when the Queen made shaped eyebrows and long foreheads fashionable. The royals then were much like today's celebrities, as everyone wanted to look like them. As such, women began to use hair-removing ointments such as walnut oil to remove hair from their upper lips and even their hairlines, sometimes moving them back more than an inch to make their foreheads look longer. One horrifying hair removal recipe called for mixing lethal arsenic with quicklime, though the mixture might have killed more than just hair follicles. But that might not be the craziest ingredient people in the Middle Ages used on their bodies. Number 2. Urine was used for everything. Without being able to run down to the store to pick up cleaning chemicals, people in the Middle Ages had to make do in a very disgusting way. Human urine was used as far back as the Roman era as a laundry detergent due to its ammonia content. While you'd think this would leave clothes much dirtier than they began, the ammonia did in fact work well as a cleaning agent, but that wasn't the only creative use for number 1 that medieval people had. In fact, they used urine for a number of gag-inducing tasks. Most commonly, urine would be left out to dry, leaving a residue of ammonia powder that was used for things like whitening teeth or cleansing the skin. While these practices can work, modern hygiene products work much better and didn't come from people's bladders. One of the oddest uses for human urine was a medical antiseptic. Royal doctors in England believed urine had medicinal uses and utilized it to clean out patients' wounds. Doctors would pay a handsome fee to urine merchants with clean samples. Bottles containing essence of urine were sold by apothecaries to be used for all manner of odd medical practices. Hopefully, we don't have to warn you to not try this yourself. Number 1. Medicine. The thought of medicine during the Middle Ages springs to mind images of plague doctors and their fearsome beaked masks. These odd masks were used to house pleasant-smelling herbs, flower petals, and spices, as doctors at this time thought it was bad odors and bad air that caused disease. This is where the word malaria comes from, literally meaning bad air. But even before the Black Plague, medicine was a misunderstood and often very dangerous practice. The main belief of the time was that the body was full of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Doctors agreed that having these 4 humors perfectly balanced brought good health, and that maladies were the result of the humors being out of balance. This was the cause for bloodletting and leeching being one of the most common medical practices to remove excess blood and balance the humors. Although today, we know this could only make patients' problems worse. There were good practices, however, as many medical texts from the time advise getting enough sleep, exercising, and maintaining a healthy diet. All things you should definitely still do today. Which did you find the most disgusting or the most surprising? Luckily, we don't have to endure these weird and unhealthy practices today, and we highly advise against trying any for yourself. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again next time.